Welcome to the overview video for Chapter 4, French and Italian Music in the 14th Century. Our learning objectives for this chapter are 1. To describe the notational innovations found in Ars Nova music. 2. To describe some of the rhythmic and other stylistic features that characterize the music of the Ars Nova, Trecento, and Ars Subtilior. 3. To describe isorhythm and its use in 14th century motets and mass movements. 4. To name and describe the forms of secular polyphonic song practiced in France and Italy during the 14th century. And 5. To identify some of the major figures, works, and terms associated with music in the 14th century. Your listening from this chapter includes NAWM 8-25A, Guillaume de Michaud's La Messe de Nostra Dame, the Kyrie, and NAWM 8-27, Guillaume de Michaud's Rose les Printemps Verdure. If the copyright law will allow me, I will share some of that audio with you in this video. If not, I will edit it out. Composers in the 14th century explored creative approaches to structure, melody, harmony, rhythm, and meter. Responding to the disorder and discontent in society due to economic troubles, famines, plague, and war, composers emphasized structure and pleasure in their music. The authority of the church was questioned and criticized, undermined by the schism between rival popes from 1378 to 1417. In the 14th century, people separated science from religion, reason and experience from faith. Through their works, writers and artists reflected daily life and people of all social classes more realistically than before. Composers focused on secular music, although the composition of sacred music remained strong. The music and teaching of Philippe de Vitry from 1291 to 1361 introduced a new French style called the Ars Nova from the 1310s to the 1370s, named after the treatise Ars Nova, which means new art. The principal innovations of the Ars Nova are the use of duple as well as triple divisions of note values, small note values called minims, new meters, syncopation, and mensuration signs. A written debate between opponents and supporters of the new art reflected differences in what is valued in music. With Ars Nova notation, composers could write down rhythms that could not be notated in the 13th century. The 4 possible combinations of time and prolation produced 4 different meters, each indicated with a different mensuration sign. About 1425, note heads began to be left open instead of being filled in. The resulting note shapes evolved into modern notation. Typical of the period is the Roman des Fauves, a satirical poem with interpolated music, including 34 motets, many with texts referring to contemporary events. Philippe de Vitry, who may have written at least some of the motets in the Roman des Fauves, used a unifying rhythmic device called isorhythm. The tenor of an isorhythmic motet is composed of a recurring rhythmic pattern called the talia and a recurring melodic pattern called the color. The talia and color are not always the same length and can be combined in various ways. Upper voices may also be isorhythmic, in whole or in part, to emphasize repeating rhythmic patterns in the tenor. Isorhythm gave unity and form to long compositions, helped in the overall planning of a composition, and made it easier for singers to understand the shape of the music and to memorize it. The technique hocket, in which voices rapidly alternate, each resting while the other sings, was common in 14th century isorhythmic works. Imperfect consonances were used more often in Ars Nova style than in the 13th century music, but they still resolved to perfect consonances, and parallel fifths and octaves were still permitted. William de Machaut, around 1300 to 1377, was the leading composer and poet of the French Ars Nova. Machaut composed isorhythmic motets that are more structurally complex than de Vitry's. Machaut's Messe de Notre Dame, Mass of Our Lady, is probably the first polyphonic setting of the Mass Ordinary written by a single composer and conceived as a unit. 14th century composers set ordinary texts as individual movements. Machaut, however, linked the 6 movements by similarities in compositional style and approach. His Mass is set for 4 voices, triplum, duplum, tenor, and contratenor. The Kyrie, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, and Ite, Missa Est are isorhythmic. The tenor carries a cantus firmus and, with the contratenor, forms the harmonic foundation. Both the tenor and the contratenor are isorhythmic. The Gloria and Credo are in the style of discant, mostly syllabic, with the 4 voices declaiming the long text together. The 3 forms fixed forms, are ballade, rondeau, and virelai. All the forms fixed have distinct patterns of repeated music and text. A ballade typically consists of 3 stanzas, each sung to the same music in the form AAB, and each ending with a refrain, capital C. In a rondo, a refrain frames the stanza, and the first half of the refrain sounds midway through the piece. Capital A, capital B, lowercase a, lowercase b, capital A, capital B. The virelai usually has 3 stanzas, each preceded by the refrain. Capital A, lowercase b, lowercase a. A final refrain concludes the piece. Machaut's monophonic French songs, chansons, continued the trouvère tradition. Machaut composed 8 polyphonic virelais and 25 monophonic virelais. In polyphonic chansons, the cantus or treble, the top part, is the principal line and was written first. This is called the treble-dominated style. The 3 genres of forms fixed tended to differ in subject matter as well as in form. Ballades were the most serious, rondeaux centered on themes of love, and virelais often related descriptions of nature to feelings of love. Although the forms fixed were traditionally associated with dancing, Machaut's polyphonic chansons were not. Machaut wrote polyphonic chansons with varied rhythms, supple syncopations, mostly stepwise melodies, and long melismas near the beginning and sometimes the middle of poetic lines. In the Trecento, Italian for the 1300s, music accompanied almost every aspect of Italian social life, but most music was not written down. The largest surviving repertoire of Italian music from the Trecento is secular polyphonic songs for elite audiences. The richly decorated Squarcialupi Codex contains 354 pieces for 2 or 3 voices from the 1300s and early 1400s, and was probably copied from about 1410 to 1415. The 14th century madrigal, not to be confused with the 16th century madrigal, is for 2 or 3 voices without instruments. It has 2 or more 3-line stanzas, all set to the same music, with a closing pair of lines called the ritornello, set to new music in a different meter. The caccia, which was in fashion from about 1345 to 1370, features 2 voices in canon at the unison. The texts are often about hunting or other animated scenes. The ballata, from ballare, which means to dance, evolved from the monophonic dance songs with choral refrains. The form of the polyphonic ballata of the late 14th century is capital A, lowercase b, lowercase a, capital A, resembling one stanza of the French virelai. Francesco Landini, 1325 to 1397, was the leading Italian composer of the 14th century. He is best known for his 140 ballate for 2 or 3 voices. Most lines of the poem are set with melismas on the first and next to last syllables. Many cadences are the type known as the Landini cadence. Italian composers began to absorb aspects of the French style in the 14th century and in the 15th century. Northern composers and musicians began to settle in Italy, and an international style developed. Polyphonic music in the 14th and early 15th centuries could be performed by a small group of voices or instruments, or a combination of the two. Instruments were classified as loud, called haut, H-A-U-T, or high, or soft, called bass or low. Low instruments included the harp, viol, lute, portative organ, transverse flute, and recorder. In this picture, you will see the tomb of Landini, and he's holding a portative organ. High instruments included shawms, cornets, and trumpets. Percussion was used with instruments of both kinds. Portative organs, positive organs, and larger organs with pedal keyboards and stops were used more widely beginning in the 14th century. Little purely instrumental music survives from the 14th century. What does survive includes keyboard arrangements of vocal works and some dances. Performers often altered notes chromatically, a practice known as musica ficta, or feigned music. Notes lying outside the standard gamut. The alternations were made to avoid tritones or to create smoother lines. A 3-voice cadence in which the upper voices are raised is called a double leading tone cadence. Composers and scribes tended not to write in accidentals, leaving it up to the performers to judge where they were needed. Modern editions suggest where changes should be made by indicating accidentals above notes. In the late 14th century, at courts in southern France and northern Italy, composers developed the ars nova style to a height of complexity and intricacy, which has been called ars subtilior. Composers, including Philippe de Caserta, tested the limits of ars nova notation with syncopation, different meters in different voices, and rhythmic disjunction. Ars subtilior music was intended for professional performers and cultivated listeners. A simpler and more influential style flourished at the same time in northern France. Some of the things that you need to know for your Chapter 4 25-point quiz include: know about the Black Death, know about Ars Nova, Ars Subtilior, Trecento, know about the different forms of meter on page 67, know about the narrative poem Roman de Favel on page 68, know what isorhythm is, know what color and talia are, know what a hocket is, know Guillaume de Machaut, know about the musical notation with the breve, the long, the semibreve, and the minim, know about prolation, see page 72, know about the musical shift in notations, know about form fix, know about the different forms like ballade, virelai, know about Landini, know about the Squarcialupi Codex, know about the Landini cadence, see page 79, know about musica ficta, know how instruments were grouped, see page 82, and know the difference between Ars Subtilior and Ars Nova. And that is your overview video for Chapter 4.